The Vanguard drifted through the black expanse of deep space, the hum of its engines a constant companion to the silence of the stars, its sleek hull reflecting the faint light of distant suns. Captain Alicia Green stood at the bridge, her eyes fixed on the console. Before her mind, as sharp as the ship's systems. She was accustomed to the stillness of space. This was her domain, a place where she and her crew felt safe. But today was different today. There was an unfamiliar sensation gnawing at the back of her mind. She couldn't shake it. Something was off. It was as though the universe had shifted just slightly enough to make her uneasy, enough to make her pause. She had no evidence to back it up, no data to prove it. But something felt wrong. Lieutenant Sam Cruz leaned over his console, his eyes scanning the readouts. He was a man of few words, and even fewer smiles. But the intensity of his gaze suggested something was amiss. He glanced at Green, a subtle shift in his posture betraying his thoughts. His hand hovered near the comms panel. The ship's AI spoke up, its voice, a neutral tone that cut through the quiet like a blade approaching their position. An unidentified fleet is detected, Captain. They are not broadcasting any signal, but their proximity to our location is consistent with known enemy movement. Sensors confirm they are closing in. Green's breath caught as the words sank in. She had hoped for nothing more than routine, but the universe had other plans. She straightened her back and took a slow breath as she keyed in a response. Commander Rachel Stone, we have a situation. Cruz confirmed that the fleet is hostile. Stone's fingers flew across her console. She didn't hesitate. Hostile signatures confirmed, Captain. No identifying markers, no hailing frequencies. They've locked onto us. They're readying weapons. Their intentions are clear. They were here for a fight for the first time in a long while. Green felt the weight of her responsibility. The Vanguard wasn't just a ship, it was a symbol of humanity's reach. It was the pinnacle of human achievement, the pride of their fleet. The thought of it falling so quickly to an unknown force was almost unbearable. She turned sharply to Cruz. Order the shields raised and begin evasive maneuvers. Now Cruz's voice was steady even as his fingers worked furiously to engage the ship's defenses. Shields online. Evasive course initiated, Captain. Within moments, the Vanguard began to swerve through space, the dark expanse suddenly feeling like a labyrinth. She could never escape. The ship's hull shook with the first impact, a brutal strike that sent alarms blaring across the bridge. Everyone braced themselves for what came next. Before the crew could react, a second blast followed, a brutal, ripping force that tore through the outer layers of the Vanguard's shielding. An explosion rattled the floor beneath them, systems overloaded, sparking fires on lower decks. Green's hands gripped the edge of her console. The ship was taking heavy damage. Cruz kept his calm, but she saw the flicker in his eyes, the realization that this wasn't a random attack. It wasn't a skirmish or a patrol. This was a full-scale assault. The Vanguard was being hunted, and every second that passed brought them closer to destruction. The second blast was followed by a gut-wrenching screech of tearing metal. The Vanguard lurched as if the very bones of the ship were protesting. The assault alarms screamed through. The bridge lights flickered and emergency systems began to activate. But the damage was already severe, systems failing one by one. Captain Alicia Green's heart raced as she fought to keep her composure. The ship was taking hits faster than it could repair itself, and the enemy, whatever they were, showed no signs of letting up. They were relentless. Lieutenant Cruz didn't waste a second hitting buttons on his console, sending orders to the lower decks. He called to the tactical team to counter the attack, but their weapons were practically useless against the overwhelming firepower of the unknown fleet. He was a man of action, and his movements reflected that, but even he couldn't hide the concern in his eyes as another blast struck near the aft section of the ship, debris rattling off the hull. The Vanguard groaned under the pressure, the force of each hit threatening to tear it apart. Commander Rachel Stone's voice cut through the chaos on the comms. Tactical systems compromised, Captain. We can't outmaneuver them much longer. Shields are holding, but barely. Their weapons are overwhelming us. The crew's desperation grew with each passing second as the ship's hull continued to absorb devastating blows. It wasn't long before the first breach alarms blared, the sounds of escaping air filling the room. A gust of pressure from one of the lower decks rattled the bridge, and Commander Stone's voice became more urgent. There's no escape option, Captain. We need to get the core stabilized, or this ship will implode within the next hour. But we're under constant fire, And there's no time for repairs. Green's mind raced. Her crew was the best humanity had to offer, but even their skill and resourcefulness couldn't defend against the sheer power of the enemy. The reality of their situation set in deep. They were outmatched. This was no ordinary attack. This was a strategic assault aimed at destroying them completely. Green glanced at Cruz, his fingers flying over his console as he assessed the ship's power systems. There was no time left for evasive action. He tapped a few commands into his console eyes, narrowed a signal emitted from the ship's systems, and then his voice was grim. "Captain, I'm reading something strange. It's not just the attacks, it's the approach. The enemy ships are positioned to ensure no escape vectors. They're hurting us. They've cut off all avenues for retreat. They intend to finish us off." Green's chest tightened as the full weight of the situation hit her. The Vanguard was trapped in the dark void of space, surrounded by an enemy fleet with nowhere to go. She moved quickly, pushing the fear aside. She couldn't let it take hold. She had to act now. "Cruz, we need to counterattack. Do whatever you can. Stone, focus on damage control and get our engines back online. But we need more time to plan. Their sheer firepower is relentless." Cruz nodded without hesitation, and Stone dove into the console, searching for any signs of life support failure. Meanwhile, Green stood at the helm, her eyes locked onto the view screen in front of her, staring into the abyss. The enemy fleet now visible on the horizon, their ships sleek and deadly, with their unfamiliar blackened hulls and glowing symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dark, like predators in the night. Something inside Green told her this wasn't just a random attack. This was personal. The silence of deep space never felt so suffocating as it did now. They were the prey, and the hunters were closing in. Captain Alicia Green stood tall, her hands gripping the console as she stared at the advancing fleet. Every instinct told her to fight back, to outthink them, but the odds were against them. She could feel the weight of the crew's eyes on her, their silent plea for leadership. The Vanguard was the flagship of humanity's exploration fleet, a symbol of their strength, and yet here it was, vulnerable, barely able to defend itself from the relentless onslaught of the Xenos fleet. Lieutenant Cruz's voice cut through her thoughts, steady but grim. "Captain, the shields are failing. We can't hold out much longer. I'm reading multiple breaches across the hull. We need to make a decision now." Green clenched her jaw, her mind racing. The Vanguard was their most advanced vessel, but the Xenos had a firepower that could punch through their defenses like they were paper. She watched as another blast hit the ship's port side, the shockwave vibrating through the deck. The ship trembled under the assault, but it wasn't the explosions that worried her. It was the silence. The eerie, chilling silence that came after each blast. The Xenos weren't rushing this. They were methodical, calculating. They were playing with them. "Cruz, can you find any weak spots?" Green asked, her voice steady even though her mind screamed for action. "I'm trying, Captain," Cruz replied, fingers flying over his console. "But the enemy is too fast, too precise. Our systems are almost completely offline. It's as if they know our every move before we make it." Green's heart skipped a beat. A sickening thought gnawed at her. Was this attack coordinated? Did the Xenos know something they didn't? Were they prepared for every move the Vanguard made? The idea that their every tactic had been predicted felt like a death sentence, but she couldn't show weakness now. "Stone, how are the engines?" Green called, turning to her commander who was hunched over her console, frantically working to keep the ship from completely falling apart. Stone's voice was strained. "The core's unstable, Captain. We've lost power to most systems. I can keep the life support running, but we can't jump or maneuver. We're a sitting target." Another hit rattled the ship, and the lights flickered once again. Green's grip tightened. Time was running out, and they had no way to escape. The Xenos were closing in, surrounding them. Slowly but surely. The very thought of retreat was impossible. The Xenos had cut off every escape route. Green exhaled slowly, her mind flipping through every option, every possibility. Her eyes swept the bridge, her crew, her family, all working tirelessly to keep the Vanguard alive. Yet the situation seemed hopeless. She refused to let the panic show. "We need a counterattack," she said, her voice firm, as if saying the words out loud would give her the strength to push through. "Cruz, can we get any weapons online?" Cruz glanced at the screen and shook his head. "The weapons array is completely offline, Captain. We're powerless." For a moment, Green felt the cold weight of defeat. The Vanguard was at their mercy. But then, as her eyes scanned the view screen again, she noticed something. A pattern. The Xenos ships weren't just attacking. They were waiting. They were deliberately pushing them into a corner, forcing them to make a mistake. Green's mind clicked into place. The Xenos wanted them to fight back, to struggle. But what if they didn't? What if they let the Xenos think they had already lost? "Cruz, I need you to do something reckless," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "Get us to their flagship. We're not running. We're going straight into the heart of their fleet." Cruz blinked, confused, but Green didn't give him time to question her. "Do it. Now." The ship trembled again as another blast shook the deck. But this time, Green felt a sense of clarity wash over her. They were going to turn the tables. The Xenos may have had superior firepower, but humanity had something they didn't: courage, ingenuity, and the drive to survive no matter the cost. "Prepare for close combat," Green ordered, her voice a whisper of steel. "We'll show them what happens when they underestimate humanity." With every ounce of her being, Green knew this was their only chance. They couldn't outrun the Xenos, but they could fight back, on their terms. Lieutenant Cruz didn't hesitate. His fingers danced across his console, overriding the Vanguard's damaged systems. He wasn't just a tactician, he was a problem solver. And right now, he was facing a problem that had no easy solution. The enemy fleet was closing in, their ships as sleek and deadly as predators. Cruz's mind raced through every possible option, trying to buy them time, trying to outmaneuver them. He glanced up at Captain Green, her eyes burning with determination. She wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. He could see the same fire in her as the first time they met on the training deck. That was the reason he had joined this mission, to follow someone who wasn't afraid to make the hard decisions. "We're going in, aren't we?" Cruz asked, his voice laced with disbelief, but also a kind of respect. "We don't have a choice," Green replied, her voice steady but full of the weight of leadership. "Prepare for close-quarter combat. They want to destroy us. Let's make sure they regret it." Cruz's eyes narrowed, a spark of understanding crossing his features. He tapped a series of commands into the console, rerouting what little power they had left into the engines. It wasn't much, just enough to move them forward, straight into the heart of the Xenos fleet. On the bridge, Commander Stone was still frantically working to stabilize the ship's core. The Vanguard was a masterpiece of engineering, but it wasn't invincible. Its systems were barely holding together, and Stone knew that if they didn't make it to the enemy flagship soon, they'd be nothing more than drifting debris in the cold vacuum of space. "Captain, I've managed to bypass some of the core's limitations," Stone reported, her voice tight with effort. "But I can't keep this up for long. We're going to need more power if we're going to make it." "We'll manage," Green said, not taking her eyes off the view screen. The Xenos ships were moving into position, their sleek silhouettes dark against the backdrop of the stars. But she could see the arrogance in their formation. They thought they had already won. They were wrong. The Vanguard lurched as the engines fired back to life, surging forward with all the power they could muster. Crews adjusted their course, keeping them steady as the enemy fleet closed in from all sides. The Xenos ships began to tighten their formation, preparing to unleash another barrage, but Green had a different plan in mind. She wasn't going to wait for the next hit. She was going to take the fight to them. "Cruz, can you get us close enough to their flagship?" Green asked, her voice steady and focused. "I can, Captain, but it's going to be a bumpy ride," Cruz replied. "They're not going to let us just waltz in." Green smiled coldly. "Good. Let them try. On the lower decks, the crew was already preparing for the worst. They had been trained for situations like this, situations where the odds were stacked against them, where survival seemed impossible. But they had never been a crew to back down. They would fight for their ship, for each other, and for humanity's future. The Xenos opened fire again. But this time, Green didn't flinch. She saw the first blast coming and ordered crews to take evasive action at the last possible second. The Vanguard rocked as the shots passed harmlessly by, but the crew held firm. Cruz gritted his teeth and pushed the ship forward, cutting through the fire with practiced precision. The enemy flagship loomed closer now, a hulking monstrosity that seemed to exude malice with every inch of its dark hull. Its weapons powered up, targeting the Vanguard with deadly intent. Green's heart raced, but she wasn't afraid. This was their moment. This was their fight. "Get ready, everyone," Green said, her voice filled with quiet authority. "We're going in." The Vanguard surged forward with a final burst of speed, charging straight at the flagship. The Xenos opened fire, but the ship's damage control teams scrambled to reinforce the shields. It wasn't enough. The Vanguard took hit after hit, but it didn't slow down. As they closed the gap, Cruz's voice rang out across the bridge. "We're almost in range, Captain. The flagship's shields are at full power, but we can breach them if we get just a little closer." A cold smile spread across Green's face. "Then let's make them pay." The Vanguard slammed into the Xenos formation, its hull scraping against the edges of enemy ships as it carved a path straight toward the heart of the fleet. The crew held on, knowing that the next few moments would determine everything. The Xenos thought they had them cornered, but they had no idea what humanity was capable of when cornered. They had no idea what was coming next. The Vanguard was a battering ram now, its hull scraped and battered, but still fighting. The Xenos fleet, once so organized and precise, now seemed to be in disarray as the human ship tore through their lines. Every impact, every brutal collision, sent shockwaves through the bridge. The crew held on, clenching their fists, their teeth gritted as they weathered each blast and jolt. But Captain Alicia Green's resolve only grew stronger with each passing second. She had taken them this far. She wasn't about to let her crew, her family, down now. "Cruz, how much longer until we're in range?" Green barked, her voice sharp, her eyes fixed on the view screen, where the enemy flagship loomed larger with each heartbeat. Cruz's fingers flew over his console, his face a mask of concentration. "We're almost there, Captain. The flagship's shields are holding strong, but they're too focused on our ship. We've got a window. I can breach their shields if we can just get a little closer." "Good. That's what I need to hear." Green's grip tightened on the armrest of her chair. She was already planning the next move in her mind, the plan forming as fast as her crew could execute it. They didn't have much time. Every second spent in close proximity to the enemy flagship was another second that could mean their deaths. But Green wasn't backing down. The Xenos had made one mistake. They'd underestimated humanity's will to fight. "Stone, how's the core?" Green called out, knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. Stone looked up, her face streaked with sweat but still determined. "It's barely holding together, Captain. If we push too hard, we risk a full meltdown. We're already operating on fumes." "We don't have time for fumes," Green snapped. "Just keep it together for one more push. That's all I'm asking." Stone nodded, her eyes locking onto Green's. There was no need for words between them. They both understood what had to happen next. The Vanguard rocketed forward, cutting through the chaos as its thrusters burned hot. The enemy ships scattered, but the flagship stayed focused, its massive guns swiveling toward them. They were so close now. Green's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't know if they would survive the next few minutes, but she knew one thing: that Xenos would regret ever attacking the human ship. The flagship opened fire, its main guns charging up with devastating force. Cruz worked furiously at the console, his hands a blur. The Vanguard dodged and weaved, barely avoiding the blasts, but one hit landed squarely on their starboard side, sending the ship lurching violently. Sparks flew from the console, and the ship's alarms blared, warning of more breaches. The crew held on, gritting their teeth, refusing to be knocked off course. "Cruise, now," Green shouted, her voice sharp, demanding action. "Almost there, Captain." Cruz's voice was strained, but there was no doubt in it. He had the target locked. With a final push, Cruz slammed his fist onto the console, and the Vanguard lurched forward, its weapons firing back at the flagship. The Xenos flagship's shields flickered, weakened by the brutal assault. The Vanguard had done it. They had created a breach. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Green felt a rush of adrenaline surge through her veins as she quickly gave the next order. "All hands, prepare for boarding. We're going in." The crew's preparation was swift, coordinated, and precise. Weapons specialist Alex Kingston and his team were the first to the boarding pods, loading them with explosives and heavy weaponry. It was a desperate plan. There was no other way to put it, but it was their only chance. If they could get on board the flagship and take out its control center, they could disable the fleet, even if it meant sacrificing everything. As the boarding pods were launched, the Vanguard took another hit, this one harder than the others. The ship's hull groaned, and the lights flickered again. The impact reverberated through the entire ship, but Green's voice was unwavering. "Stay focused. We're not done yet." The pods flew toward the flagship, cutting through the chaos, and as the crew aboard the Vanguard braced themselves, they knew this was their final chance. There was no going back. They were going to board the enemy flagship, and they were going to take it down, even if it cost them everything. "We're in position," Kingston's voice crackled over the comms. "Ready to breach." "Do it," Green ordered, her heart pounding in her chest. The pods impacted the flagship with a violent explosion, and the crew of the Vanguard was about to make their mark. Their final command had begun, and they weren't about to back down now. The explosion echoed through the flagship's hull, a thunderous sound that shook the very core of the enemy vessel. The boarding pods had breached the outer layers, and the crew of the Vanguard was now on the flagship, ready to strike at the heart of the Xenos fleet. Inside the pods, adrenaline flooded the veins of every soldier and officer, the familiar rush of battle pushing them forward. They had trained for moments like this, moments where survival meant taking the fight to the enemy with everything they had. "Kingston, status report," Green barked, her voice cutting through the static on the comms as the Vanguard rocked once again from another blast. "We're in, Captain. The flagship's corridors are full of resistance, but we got our way clear to their central command center. We've encountered heavy opposition." Kingston's voice came through, calm but filled with urgency. "We've lost a few good men already, but we're pushing forward." Green's heart tightened, the weight of leadership pressing down on her shoulders. Every life lost in this fight was a sacrifice, a reminder of just how high the stakes were. But there was no time for mourning, not yet. Not while they still had a chance to win. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand. "Keep moving, Kingston. You need to take that command center, no matter the cost. We're running out of time," Green ordered, her voice hard but resolute. On the flagship, Kingston and his team advanced through the corridors, weapons raised, their eyes sharp for any sign of movement. The Xenos were a formidable force, their alien forms sleek and swift. But they were not invincible. The human soldiers, though outnumbered, fought with a fire that came from deep within, a will to survive, to protect their home. "They're everywhere," shouted one of the soldiers, a young recruit named Marcus. "We need more firepower." "Keep moving," Kingston shouted back, his voice steady. "The command center is just ahead. We don't need to kill them all. Just get us to the control hub, and we'll disable their fleet." The Xenos seemed to be everywhere, their strange weapons firing with precision, but Kingston's team was determined. They fought back with everything they had, grenades and blasters lighting up the darkened hallways, cutting through the Xenos ranks one by one. The scent of smoke and burnt metal filled the air, mixing with the acrid stench of alien blood as the soldiers pushed forward. They were close now, so close. "Stay focused." Kingston's voice came through the comms once again. "We're almost there. Just a few more meters." Back on the Vanguard, Green stood firm at the helm, her fingers tight on the console as she watched the battle unfold through the data streaming in from the boarding pods. She felt the lives of every crew member aboard her ship as if they were her own, the weight of their sacrifice heavy on her shoulders. The Vanguard had given them the chance to fight, but it was the crew on the flagship that would determine their fate. The ship lurched again, another massive impact shaking the vessel as the Xenos refused to relent. But Green held her ground, her eyes narrowing with determination. She would not let her people die in vain. The decision had been made. They would either take the flagship or be destroyed in the process. There was no middle ground. A voice broke through her thoughts. Commander Stone, panting and clearly on the edge. "Captain, we've got a problem. The core's going critical. I don't know how much longer we can keep it stable." Green's eyes snapped to the monitor. They had minutes at most before the Vanguard's core detonated, and without their engines or shields fully functional, there would be no escape. They couldn't afford to fail. "Stone, keep it together. We don't have an option to quit now. Get that core stable, or we'll be taking down the whole Xenos fleet with us," Green said, her voice sharp as a blade. She turned back to the comms as Kingston's team reached the command center. "We've got it," Kingston's voice rang out, filled with triumph. "The control hub's ours. We're sending the signal now. It's done." Green felt a surge of hope, a feeling she hadn't dared to entertain until now. But it wasn't over. Not yet. "Kingston, get out of there now. Evacuate immediately," Green ordered. "We're on our way, Captain," Kingston replied. "But we're not leaving anyone behind." As the boarding team began their retreat, Green's fingers danced across her console, directing the remaining power from the Vanguard to deliver the final blow. The Xenos flagship systems began to shut down one by one, its once imposing weapons systems flickering to a halt. The tide was turning. The enemy was faltering. But Green knew it wasn't over until the last shot was fired. She steeled herself, waiting for Kingston's team to report in and praying they would make it back in time. The countdown was ticking, and every second could be their last. But in that moment, she allowed herself one brief, hopeful thought. Humanity wasn't done yet. The retreat was chaotic, the corridors of the Xenos flagship alive with the sounds of distant explosions and gunfire. Kingston's team fought their way back, their heavy boots slamming against the metal floors as they moved with purpose and precision. The command center had fallen, but now the real challenge began, escaping before the entire flagship fell apart. "Move faster, people," Kingston shouted, firing a shot at an advancing Xenos soldier. The creature fell, its sleek body crumpling to the ground with unnerving speed. "We've got our opening, but we need to make it to the pods. Now." The Xenos, though formidable in their own right, were no match for the human soldiers' grit and determination. But the fight wasn't over. The flagship was falling apart around them. The control center destroyed, systems failing across the ship. But even in the midst of this chaos, the Xenos didn't give up easily. They pushed back, rallying around their last strongholds, desperate to stop the humans from escaping. Kingston cursed under his breath. They were close to the escape pods, but the Xenos were regrouping, and they weren't going to let them leave without a fight. "Kingston to Vanguard. We're almost there, but we've got resistance. Prepare to launch the pods on my command." Acknowledged Kingston. "Prepare for immediate evacuation," Captain Green responded, her voice firm, as always, but there was no mistaking the urgency in her tone. She knew the risks they were facing. The Vanguard was holding, but the ship wasn't going to last much longer. They had only one chance to get out. "All right, team, here's the plan," Kingston said, scanning the group of soldiers around him. We fight our way through to the pod bay. We don't stop. We don't wait for backup. We get to those pods, and we get back to the vanguard. Move out. The soldiers responded in unison, their resolve unshakable. They knew what was at stake. They had been through hell together and come out the other side, and they weren't going to fail now. As they made their way down the narrow corridor, the sound of Xenos' footsteps echoed behind them. The flagship was being torn apart by the damage they'd inflicted, but that didn't stop the enemy from hunting them down. Kingston turned sharply, taking down another Xenos soldier who had emerged from a side corridor. The creature fell with a guttural scream, its weapon clattering to the floor. The rest of the team continued to push forward, but they were running out of time. Kingston checked his wrist chrono. They had less than 3 minutes before the Vanguard's core reached critical mass. If they didn't make it back, the entire fleet would be gone, human and Xenos alike. "Come on, people," Kingston urged, sweat dripping down his brow. They were so close now. "We've got one shot at this." With a final push, they reached the pod bay. But just as they were about to reach the safety of the escape pods, the Xenos struck back with brutal force. A blast of alien weaponry tore through the walls, and the soldiers ducked for cover, returning fire in a hail of laser blasts. The pod bay door was right there, but it was heavily guarded by a group of Xenos, their glowing eyes narrowing as they locked onto their targets. "We need a way out of here," shouted Marcus, one of the younger soldiers. "We can't fight them all." Kingston's mind raced. There was no way they could engage in a prolonged firefight and still escape. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and the clock was ticking. "Grenades," Kingston shouted. "Deploy the grenades now." One of the soldiers, a quick-thinking specialist named Evelyn, pulled out a series of high-impact grenades. She threw them with deadly accuracy, each one exploding in a burst of light and sound that disoriented the Xenos soldiers, sending them reeling. The blast cleared a path to the pods, and Kingston didn't waste a second. "Move," he yelled. The team sprinted for the pods, the Xenos still recovering from the explosion, but too late to stop them. One by one, they clambered into the pods, securing their harnesses and preparing for launch. Kingston was the last aboard, looking over his shoulder one last time. The hallway was in chaos, but they had made it. "Launch the pods, Vanguard," Kingston said, his voice urgent as the final pod doors slammed shut. "We're ready to go." "Pod launch sequence initiated," came the cold, automated response from the Vanguard's eye. "Ejecting in 3, 2, 1. The escape pods shot out into the cold vacuum of space, the Vanguard's weapons still firing in a desperate bid to cover their retreat. Kingston felt the jolt of the pod's launch as it sped away from the doomed flagship. They had done it. They had made it off the ship, but the fight wasn't over. The Xenos flagship, its control systems crippled, was starting to fall apart. The explosions from the human assault had weakened its core, and now, with the flagship no longer functioning, it began to destabilize. From their escape pods, Kingston and his team watched as the massive ship shuddered, then broke apart in a series of violent explosions. It was a stunning sight, the end of the Xenos' reign of terror. Humanity had struck a decisive blow. But Kingston knew that this was just the beginning. There was still a war to win. There were still worlds to save. They had survived, but now they had to make sure humanity's future wasn't defined by the Xenos. It was up to them to carry the torch forward, to rebuild, and to ensure that the final command, their final stand, was just the start of humanity's victory. The escape pods streaked through space, their small forms vulnerable against the vast emptiness. Kingston sat in the cramped space, his knuckles white, as he gripped the control panel. His team was with him, each one silent, but the tension in the pod was palpable. They had escaped the Xenos flagship, but their journey was far from over. He could still feel the shockwaves of the explosion in his bones. The image of the massive enemy ship breaking apart still burned into his mind. But that victory came at a price. Too many had fallen along the way, and they hadn't yet seen the full consequences of their actions. The pod's eye chimed, breaking the stillness. Approaching Vanguard, estimated docking in 60 seconds. Kingston leaned back in his seat, exhaling a long breath. They were going to make it. The Vanguard had withstood the fight, but how much longer it could hold together was anyone's guess. He checked the readouts on the pod's monitor, searching for any sign of danger, but all he saw was the long, dark shadow of the ship looming ahead. "Everyone, brace yourselves," Kingston said, his voice steady, though there was a tightness to it. "We're going back in. We're not done yet." The crew nodded silently, their faces tired but resolute. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Xenos were a formidable force, but now they had seen what humanity could do. The Vanguard had led the charge, and Kingston wasn't about to let it all be for nothing. As the pod docked with the Vanguard, the hatch hissed open. Kingston was the first to step out, his boots clanging on the metal floor of the ship's landing bay. The ship's lights flickered weakly, but the crew was already moving to assist the survivors, helping them out of their pods. Kingston's eyes searched for Captain Green. She had been the heart of this mission, and now he needed her more than ever. "Kingston," a familiar voice called out from the shadows. Captain Green appeared, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her posture as commanding as ever. "We made it." "We did," Kingston replied, nodding. "But we've lost a lot, Captain. Too many." Green's gaze softened for a moment. She understood. They all understood. But there was no time to mourn. Not yet. "Not now," Green said, her voice steady. "We have to think ahead. The Xenos might have lost their flagship, but they're not gone. They'll regroup, they'll come back. We need to prepare for what's next." Kingston nodded. He had seen the same thing in her eyes, the same unwavering resolve that had kept them going even when the odds were impossible. He could hear the hum of the Vanguard's dying engines, but the sound was strangely comforting. The ship was battered, its systems hanging on by a thread, but it was still alive. And so were they. "Where do we go from here?" Kingston asked. "We fight," Green said, her eyes narrowing. "We rebuild. We've shown the Xenos that they can bleed, and we've made them pay. Now we make sure they never forget who they're dealing with. The war isn't over, Kingston, not by a long shot. We're going to take the fight to them." As she spoke, Kingston's mind raced through the possibilities. They had won a battle, but the war was far from decided. The Xenos were ruthless, but they had made a mistake. They had underestimated humanity, and now they would see just how dangerous it could be. "Captain, if we're going to win this war, we need more than just the Vanguard," Kingston said, his voice laced with the hard-earned wisdom of battle. "We need to unite humanity. We need to strike back hard." "We will," Green replied, her voice resolute, "and we will do it together. One ship at a time, one battle at a time." The crew gathered around them, exhausted but ready for the next fight. They had survived against impossible odds. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, more united. They had shown the Xenos that humanity would never bow down to invaders, no matter how advanced or powerful they were. The Vanguard's hull groaned in protest as the remaining systems powered down, but the crew stood together, resolute. They weren't done, not by a long shot. And as the stars stretched out before them, a new sense of purpose settled over the crew. The Xenos had attacked a human ship, but humanity had struck back with a force they would never forget. Now it was time to finish what they had started, to ensure the survival of the human race, and to show the galaxy what true strength looked like. The war was just beginning, and humanity was ready to fight.